Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today I'm happy to announce I'm updating the Victualers Yard so that by the time you see this, there'll be a couple of new posters available. These are going to be very large posters. Those of you who were at the conference on HMS Belfast will have seen them already. And I'm just showing you how easy it is to fill in a new item. So I'm putting in a title. Spoiler alert, it's USS Texas at the hypothetical Battle of Texel. And then I'm just adding in an image of the original piece of artwork, and then it's just a case of pricing up and putting in stock numbers. Initially I'm putting in 10 because unlike the previous posters which have been at A3 or A4 size, this, as you can tell by the dimensions I just put in there, these are big. These are B1 size, so even slightly larger than A0. They're actually about a metre across, just over 3 feet in American and British Imperial for that matter. And the first one is, as I said, USS Texas in her original format, and you can see I'm also changing up how it's going to be displayed. All of this is obviously being set to launch the same week that this video goes live. Initially with 10 of each in stock, and then once those are sold, I can get more made, because obviously these are quite big and expensive to make compared to the smaller posters. The other one, as you can see, is USS Texas in dry dock, based on a series of photos I took while I was there. Nice and easy setup with Squarespace. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. So in a recent Drydock live stream, I came across the question about visualizing the Dreadnought race in a little bit more detail, both in terms of number of ships constructed and when they came in service, but also in terms of numbers of guns, broadside weight of guns, that kind of thing, trying to assess the effectiveness of various battle fleets during the Dreadnought Arms Race in the lead up to and during World War I. And I thought, well, that's a good idea, but it's not a question I could answer there and then on the live stream. It requires quite a bit of work to put all the data together, but I went ahead and did it anyway. And so, well, today you're going to get the Dreadnought Arms Race as explained with Excel graphs and tables, although fortunately you only have to deal with the graphs. And today we're going to be looking at the three largest navies of World War I, that being the Royal Navy, the German Navy, and the US Navy. And before you ask, yes, I could include the Russians, the Japanese, the Italians, the French, even the Spanish, that they had dreadnoughts and so on and so forth. However, that would make for an awful lot of annoyingly clustered lines right near the bottom, and doesn't really tell us all that much about who was in front. So if you want me to expand the data set to include all of those, and perhaps obviously so they have their own individual graphs as well, sure, I can do that. I've got the format and the formula all set up for it anyway. It won't be that difficult to do. But in terms of just being able to more easily visualize what's going on, I think just sticking with the British, the Germans, and the Americans is best for this presentation. And just a quick few points of data reference. I'm going purely by battleships. I could do battle cruisers as a separate thing, but basically, obviously, that's a British-German race with the Japanese popping up towards the end of it, and really should be its own thing at some point. So we're just looking at battleships, and in terms of how I'm classifying them by their keel lay date. So everything is split into quarters, so quarter 1, 2, 3, 4 of each year. And if the ship was laid down in that quarter, it shows up as under construction in that quarter. And likewise, if it's completed or commissioned in a given quarter, it shows up in that quarter. So, for example, if a ship is laid down in February 1910, it'll show up in quarter 1, 1910. And if it's commissioned in May 1913, then it's going to show up as a commissioned vessel in quarter 2 of 1913. Of course, exactly how operational a ship is at the time of its commissioning or completion compared to joining the fleet in full active service varies quite considerably, depending on did they run the trials before or after, how quickly can the crew get acclimatized, things, etc., etc. But in at least theoretical terms, once a ship is commissioned, you could, in theory, drag it onto the battlefield the next day if you absolutely had to. So we're going to start with this chart. This is the total number of battleships for the three navies. We've got the British in shades of red, the Germans in shades of grey, and the Americans in shades of blue. The paler shade shows ships under construction,
and the solid shade shows ships in service. And yes, this does account for ships that leave service, like Audacious and Vanguard. And for ships under construction, I chose to incorporate the build times for the ships that actually entered those navies, even if technically some of them, like Erin, Agincourt and Canada, weren't constructed for the Royal Navy at the time. They were obviously then forcibly purchased, but they ultimately ended up in that navy, so their construction time has to be included as well, otherwise you get ships appearing from nowhere. And it's also a useful shorthand to show building capacity as well. Yes, I didn't include Salamis in the Germans, but she was never completed, so she'd just show up as a kind of vaguely under construction single vessel. Doesn't really change all that much. Now, I understand that this graph might be a little confusing to some onlookers, so I switched over to just showing the two separate sections, construction and completion. And this really tells an interesting story, because you can see, obviously, the Royal Navy starting off ahead of everybody else with Dreadnought there. But then, once everybody starts building Dreadnoughts in earnest, so you have the South Carolinas for the US coming along next, followed by the Nassaus for the Germans, for the next few years, it's a very close race. People sometimes talk about, maybe the British were overdoing it when they were saying, the Germans might outpace them in a year or two, etc. Well, actually, no. If you look at this graph, you'll see that at various points throughout 1907, 1908, 1909, the Germans, even if we're just looking at battleships, were actually building more ships than the Royal Navy was at various points. Now, okay, granted, some of this is because the British were building and launching ships slightly quicker, but it's not a huge margin. And the US wasn't doing too badly in terms of keeping up. They're a little bit behind most of the time, but not by a huge amount. The interesting thing, of course, is you can then see, as we get through 1909, 1910, we start to see the effects of the We Want 8 and We Won't Wait campaign in Britain, congressional limitations in the US, and the German army going, hey, we want some of our money back over in Germany. Because by the time you move forward to 1910, you can see that although the German build program has been ahead of the Royal Navy in terms of number of hulls under construction, more than it's been behind for the past couple of years, by the end of 1909, start 1910, it's actually starting to drop behind. Then it catastrophically drops off. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy's build program goes stratospheric right up until 1914, when the outbreak of World War I means that, both the British and the German programs drop off, but the drop-off is obviously much more noticeable in the British line because it's been so much higher. Whereas the US just keeps chugging away because they don't particularly care about the fact that the Europeans are at war, and in fact they have a little bit of a boost thanks to various factors, including the start of construction on the New Mexicos. And so you end up with the Americans overhauling the Germans in terms of number of ships under construction by the end of 1914. And by the time you get to early 1916, because Britain's not laid down any new capital ships since the war began, Britain's number of ships under construction is still dropping off, actually drops below the Germans because the British are actually finishing their ships, whereas a lot of the German ones remain on the stocks. And the Americans are ahead of everybody by 1917. But how does this translate into number of ships actually in service? Well, as you can see here, the graph does tell a slightly different story. Obviously, the Royal Navy has an initial advantage there with Dreadnought literally holding a one-point line for quite a few years. But then, thanks to the slightly faster nature of British shipyards, despite the fact that the Germans have more hulls on the stocks at any one time during a good chunk of the latter 1900s, as we just saw, Britain takes an early lead in number of hulls actually in service and keeps that lead, very slightly widening it as time goes on. And of course, as this is at the tail end of construction, the effect of the We Want 8 and We Won't Wait campaign shows up only by the time of late 1914, early 1915, where you can see suddenly Royal Navy numbers keep going up and up and up, admittedly helped somewhat by the requisition of those 3 ships that they were building for other people. And they'll just keep going up as that early 1910s build boost that the Royal Navy gets just starts commissioning into the fleet, capping out with the last ship entering service towards the end of 1916, having opened up an absolutely huge margin on the Germans, who have been relatively static from about mid-1914, with only the commissioning of Baden and Bayern pushing the numbers up a little bit. Now, obviously, the sheer build volume of both the British and the Germans means that by late 1912, both navies are pulling well ahead of the Americans, although obviously the British are somewhat further ahead than the Germans. But then you can see once you get to late 1915, as the German commission rate has dropped off dramatically, but the Americans just keep going, this rather large gap between the US and German fleets in late 14, early 15 is gradually closed as the US keeps commissioning more and more ships until by 1918 and the war's end, you can see that actually there's a very small gap of only about 3 ships between the battleship numbers for the Americans and the battleship numbers for the Germans. So then we move on to another way of visualizing it. Number of guns in different calibers. Now, unfortunately, putting this in a table where everybody gets all their guns in one place is essentially impossible. It just looks like spaghetti gone mad. But you can do it by individual navy, which has a few interesting factoids in and of itself. So this is the Royal Navy's chart. This is the number of guns available to the fleet in the varying calibers over time. So obviously the first line is the 12-inch line, and then we have the yellow line, which is for the 13.5-inch guns. There's the 14-inch guns in blue and the 15-inch guns in green. So as you can see, again, Dreadnought starts off everything with bringing 10 guns to the table, then everything starts to climb rather rapidly, and then you can actually see the direct cut-off when the Royal Navy stops bringing 12-inch guns to the party and starts bringing the 13.5-inch guns in, and then there's a very, very sharp climb, because of course there's 10 guns on all the Royal Navy 12-inch ships and 10 guns on the 13.5-inch ships, but they're building the 13.5-inch ships in larger numbers. And then, of course, there's a nice neat cut-off again, and then the 15-inch guns on the Queen Elizabeth and Revenge come in, and then the 14-inch line, that's literally just HMS Canada with her 10 guns. And before anyone's wondering, yes, the little step up in 12-inch gun numbers around about the beginning of 1914, that's when Agincourt comes into play. That step up is just Agincourt on her own, and then the step down in 1917 is the destruction of HMS Vanguard. You might be wondering why in these you haven't been able to see what happens to Audacious. Well, that's because lots of ships are being brought online at the same time that Audacious is sunk, and therefore, while she does reduce the overall count, in her case 13.5-inch guns, you have a similar number of 13.5 coming into service, so you don't actually see it in the graph. In her case, it's actually HMS Erin coming online in the same quarter. For the Germans, the graph is a lot simpler. You have a very quick jump in the number of 11-inch guns with the Nassaus, but then, of course, as soon as the Nassaus are in service, that's it. So you just have the orange-yellow line, which is simply just 12-inch guns, because that equips the vast majority of the Germans' dreadnoughts. But then you can see that stops as well, and then there's a longish gap before Baden and then Bayern come into service with their 15-inch guns, and that's pretty much it for the Germans. And then the simplest graph of all, of course, is the Americans, because there's just 12-inch guns going up and up and up, coming into commission between the end of 1909 and the middle of 1912. And then there's a little bit of a gap, and then the 14-inch guns start to arrive with Texas and New York. And then, as you can see, there's a little bit of a plateau, and then the Nevadas come in, and it just starts going up and up and up. And interestingly, that means that it actually takes the Americans the longest to overcome their initial Dreadnought gun caliber, because the British have more 13.5-inch guns in the fleet than they do 12-inch guns around about the start of the First World War. The Germans overtake the number of 11-inch guns in the fleet with 12-inch guns around 1912, but as you can see here, despite building ships with 10 and then 12 14-inch guns, the sheer number of 12-inch guns in the American fleet means that they don't actually surpass that number using their 14-inch ships until pretty much the end of World War II in early 1918. Of course, if you want to flip things around and use 12-inch as the number to be surpassed, then of course the Americans are the only one of two navies that actually surpass that number, because the Germans only ever have 16 15-inch guns in service with Baden and Bayern. But I think a rather interesting thing compared to number of guns is broadside weight. Now, this is measured in pounds because it's the weight of the shell in pounds multiplied by the number of guns on the broadside. And this differs slightly from the number of guns in two primary ways. Firstly, of course, not all guns on a ship are broadside guns for a given broadside. So, for example, if you're looking at HMS Dreadnought, she's got 10 guns. So on the table that shows number of guns, that's 10. But in this table, which is the broadside weight, you can only count 8 of those guns on the broadside. And the same for the Germans. There are 12 guns on each Nassau class and each Helgoland class, but only 8 guns can contribute to a given broadside. So that changes the figure slightly. And then, of course, the larger the gun, generally the heavier the shell. So here is the British, as you might be able to tell from the key there on the side, because of the 14 inches making an appearance alongside the 15. And this is actually really interesting, because bear in mind, we saw on the previous graphs that the British only just about surpassed the number of 12-inch guns in the fleet with the 13.5-inch, and in terms of guns the British actually intended to bring into their fleet, the 15-inch remains well behind both the 12-inch and the 13.5-inch throughout the entire war. But while we have the total broadside weight here in purple, you can see that obviously initially the total line and the 12-inch line in red are exactly the same, but then as the 12-inch broadside levels off, because they stop introducing 12-inch except for that slight rise with Agincourt and then the dip with the loss of Vanguard, you can see that although there's eventually only barely more 13.5-inch guns than 12-inch, the broadside weight of those 13.5-inch guns, because each broadside on each British 13.5-inch ship is 10 guns, whereas on some British 12-inch ships it's 8 guns, in fact most of them, and some of the 12 inches have 10-gun broadsides, plus the additional weight of those shells. And yes, I did take into account the differing weights of the lighter and heavier ammunition guns for the 13.5-inch. But you can see that by the time all of the 12 and 13.5-inch guns are in service, the 13.5-inch broadside total is very nearly double that of the 12-inch broadside. And then the 15-inch guns come in, and despite numerically being the least of the three, obviously the 14-inch being an outlier, you can see that very quickly, once the Queen Elizabeths are in service, they on their own have more broadside firepower than the entirety of the British 12-inch battle line, despite only numbering 5 ships. And once the Revenge class get into service, those ships have almost as much broadside weight as all the 13.5-inch ships and considerably more than all the 12-inch ships. And you see a slightly similar thing happening with the Germans. Once again, the purple line is the total, red is the first caliber, the 11-inch in this case, the orange-yellow is 12-inch, and in this case the blue is 15-inch. So once again, the red line and the purple line are the same for a little bit. Now, obviously, because the 11-inch is only on one class of battleship in the High Seas Fleet, not surprisingly, the 12-inch broadside very rapidly overhauls and just goes up and up and up until all the 12-inch ships are in service. But then I thought this was quite a fun one, given that there are 4 Nassau class, each with 12 guns, albeit an 8-gun broadside. The 2 Bardens, or Bayerns, depending on how you want to classify them, which are brought into service, just those 2 ships, again with 8-gun broadsides, between them have a somewhat greater broadside weight than all 4 Nassau class do, as you can see there just at the bottom right of the graph. And for the Americans, well, you've only got the 12-inch line, which initially matches with the total, as I said, so then it levels out as a red line, and then the 14-inch line, which, as you can see, climbs quite quickly, actually overhauling the 12-inch broadsides in about the middle of the war, 1916-ish or so. And then that brings us on to the final graph for this little explanatory video, which is the broadside weight of the 3 different navies. So you've got the British in red, the Germans in black, and the Americans in blue. Now, this is a rather interesting one, because we've already established that the Germans had more ships in service than the Americans, for the most part, and that they were generally building more ships until, obviously, the start of the First World War put a bit of a kibosh on that. However, when you look at overall broadside weight, because the Germans start off with 11-inch guns, which have a relatively light shell, and then their first generation of ships with 12-inch guns end up with the same hexagonal layout, so they only have 8-gun broadsides for their first 2 classes, and then The rest of their 12-inch ships only have 10-gun broadsides, whereas, of course, the Americans with their 12-inch ships go 8 guns, then they go up to 10 guns, and then they go up to 12 guns, and then go back down to 10 guns with a 14-inch, much heavier shells. It turns out that who has the heaviest total broadside between the numerically superior high seas fleet and the US Navy actually goes back and forth quite a bit, as you can see. Through 1910, 11, and 12, apart from a very, very early start when the Germans have a Nassau in service, and, well, the Americans don't, the Americans have actually a slightly superior weight of broadside to the Germans up until the end of 1912. It's a little touch and go in the middle of 1912, but then in 1913, the Germans overhaul them, and this is representing essentially just the fact the Germans are bringing along a lot more ships at this point, as well as having gone up to the 12-inch gun. But then you can see that despite the fact the Germans are bringing online considerably more hulls until pretty much the end of 1914, so this is when the Kaisers and the Königs are coming in, the fact the Americans are only introducing half as many ships, but with 2 more guns on the broadside and 14-inch weapons instead of 12-inch, means that the Americans are keeping generally in touch, and as soon as the Germans start to slow down, the Americans are just continuing to introduce those 14-inch guns. By around the time of the Battle of Jutland, the Americans have slightly overtaken the Germans, even with the Bayerns coming in, and by the end of the war, the American fleet, again, despite being numerically somewhat inferior, has a notably superior broadside weight compared to the Germans by a factor of almost 20% or so, simply because of those large numbers of 14-inch guns. Of course, the Royal Navy is sitting there with twice as much broadside firepower as both the US Navy and the German Navy combined, wondering if this is some kind of joke that they're too explosive to understand. But nonetheless, it's an interesting graph, especially round about 1913, 1914, where, as I said, not only do you get the effect of the American 14-inch ships starting to come online, allowing them to keep pace with and then overhaul the Germans despite much fewer hulls coming into service, but the sheer ridiculous level of increase and the massive gap that the Royal Navy opens up comes about almost entirely starting in 1913, because at this point you're just seeing, the last of the 13.5-inch ships coming in, but then a constant flow of 15-inch armed ships. And yes, they've only got 8 guns compared to the American 12 guns on their later standards, but those 15-inch guns pack a heck of a shell, and there's a lot of them, resulting in, as I said, the British coming up at well over 400,000 pounds of broadside weight. So that is the Dreadnought Arms Race of World War I, visualized in a series of graphs looking at hull numbers, broadside weight, and number of guns. And if you'd like to see the battlecruiser one, or you want me to enlarge these graphs to show the smaller navies, or maybe do the smaller navies as their own separate thing, let me know in the comments below. Bye for now.